Hello everyone, and fair warning, I can tell you today is going to be a longer show, but it is going to be a good and important show. 3 stories for you today, and they are majorly important. First, we start with probably the most horrific story that we've covered. It's honestly kind of hard to say. 100 plus people shot on February the 29th. It was about 2 days ago, waiting for flour and food aid. We'll get into the electronic intifada breakdown, but most importantly, we're going to tell you what the BBC has had to say about it. I believe this came out earlier today. Really good and interesting stuff. Also, an absolutely shocking and discrediting story about the New York Times screams without words story about supposed systematic Hamas rape on October 7th. The Intercept really has a great article about it that's making really, all the haters mad, including the New York Times, which, literally causing the New York Times to go on a literal witch hunt of their Arab employees, Middle Eastern employees, demanding private documents from them, according to the New York Times Union. And we close it off with a pretty devastating poll for Joe Biden. He is down 5 to Trump in the New York Times Siena College poll, one of the most respected out there. We're going to break down some of the takeaways from that to close things out. First, though, it is being called the Flower Massacre. The Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza said that 112 Palestinians were killed and another 760 injured after Israeli forces opened fire towards Palestinians who had gathered to receive food aid on Thursday. Probably one of the deadliest moments in the 4.5 months of, really genocide in Gaza, with the death toll climbing past 30,000 on Thursday. The actual number of fatalities will probably take a very, very long time, obviously, to actually, find out. And we are just hearing continuing reports of this is from Abu Bakr Abed, one of the correspondents to Electronic Intifada, essentially saying that there has been no real aid. Really in the first place, Abed is immunocompromised and he hasn't eaten meat he said he's probably eaten meat only once since October 7th. And trust me, he is not getting access to all the finest vegan options right now in Gaza. And the lack of access to nutrition he needs to cause him to be repeatedly sick, and the lack of clean water results in regular stomach pain. Normally, it's just bread and a tomato for him, but he says that is relatively fortunate. 1 in 4 people in Gaza currently are facing levels of absolutely catastrophic food insecurity, with continuing aid reaching the north, which of course was where this flower massacre took place. 7 children, meanwhile, have also died from starvation and dehydration at the Kamal Adwan hospital in the north, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza, essentially where they're just giving out first aid with what little bandages they have left at this point. Really just a complete and utter flagrant massacre. Going to go really do, and I think it's very, very telling. We've heard a lot of stuff about this. We've, a lot of kind of going back and forth on the, again, some really just horrific notifications we've seen from, the New York Times, CNN. Many people were affected. That was the way the New York Times put it. When, people were killed. All the just absolutely disgusting, offensive, passive voice that we've been seeing from these news organizations. CNN called it a chaotic incident, just saying the accounts of what happened really very just differently, and just continuous, nonsense, coming from. There's no other way. It's just absolute nonsense. And we even have, I think, what the BBC says in this and the conclusions that they reach, just from all the evidence, I think is more telling than anything the Electronic Intifada could put out, because again, they do absolutely incredible and important work, but they are not the BBC. Like the Electronic Intifada is going to, highlight really the facts of what's going on in the Palestinian situation always, but when you have the BBC kind of coming out and saying that it's going to be a little bit more important, But first, there are some important details to get to as well in this electronic intifada story. Ismail Al-Ghul, a reporter with Al Jazeera, said that after opening fire on them, Israeli tanks ran over dead and injured people, and that ambulances were unable to reach the scene because roads were totally destroyed. Probably one of the most basic tenets of the Israeli occupation. Many of those were brought to Al-Shifa Hospital, which is only partially functional after being raided by Israel forces last November. Still looking, by the way, for that Hamas command and control center. With the shortage of medical staff, citizens were left to deal with the injured and attempt to administer first aid themselves. Shadal Al-Shafei, a department head at Al-Shifa Hospital, said the majority of victims suffered gunshot and shrapnel in the head and the upper parts of their bodies. Again, pretty much every doctor who has treated it, everyone who was there, all the videos, and we'll get into some of that, suggests that it was gunfire, and that this Israeli narrative, this absolutely genocidal Israeli narrative of them, kind of swarming around the IDF truck, charging them, for this food, was the cause of the death, and was, in a crush, and, literally just changing their story multiple times within hours, depending on which spokesperson you talk to. Daniel Hagari, the chief Israeli military spokesperson, said during a press conference the trucks were part of a convoy carrying aid from Egypt that were screened at the Kerem Shalom, Kerem Abu Salem crossing and entered Gaza for distribution by private contractors. He claimed the tanks were present to secure the humanitarian corridor for the aid convoy, and the troops cautiously tried to disperse people. He said, "We're just warning shots." And we will kind of go through all of this. And I think it's kind of important to start here, from the beginning. This really, it's a very, and again, I'm not here to obviously stand by what's going on with BBC all the time, but they, I think, had a pretty, very eyebrow-raising report because of the, strength of the kind of condemnation of what Israel has done. And first off, they say right at the bat, at least 112 Palestinians were killed as crowds rushed around lorries delivering desperately needed food aid in the small hours of Thursday morning, according to the Hamas. Oh, there we go. I thought they were going to say, "Oh no, Hamas run health ministry." Okay, so right off the bat, they're setting the numbers again from the Gaza health ministry that is, again, run by civil servants due to the nature of the fact that Gaza is kind of a one-party state, have to be members of Hamas. So, again, and this is a situation that the Gaza Health Ministry has found, the IDF has found. Even the IDF, according to Israeli reports, has said that they find the Gaza Health Ministry numbers to be completely accurate after surveilling them and how they do their methods. The IDF intelligence internally even uses them. But, of course, there's still doubt being cast on them as Hamas run. Even as, war crimes happen in front of our eyes. 760 people were injured. The tragic incident has given rise to different claims about what happened and who was responsible for the carnage. Of course. So completely awful framing there. But we do have to get into it kind of on the, play-by-play basis. A footage posted on Instagram on 23:30 local time, so 11:30 local time, 11:30 p.m., on the 20th of February, shows that some hundreds of people huddled around fires as they wait a humanitarian aid shipment. And again, people are like, why are they collecting humanitarian aid in the night? Because that's when Israel let it through. Again, it's just like people, if you hear people say that, just do not listen to a single thing that they say after that, because they're telling you something that is just so either misinformed or so egregiously dishonest that is utterly disqualifying for them ever having, a valid opinion on this stuff ever again. The video, kind of camped out on Al Rashid Street in kind of the north western portion of Gaza. This is the street right by the beach there, with the Mediterranean Sea. At around 4 local time, 4 a.m. on the 29th, a convoy of lorries carrying the aid from Egypt passes through the IDF location, making its way along Al Rashid Street, according to this footage. The IDF said there were 30 lorries in the convoy, when an eyewitness told the BBC there were 18. Even to the lower figure, it would have stretched out for a long time. The IDF's chief spokesperson, Daniel Hagari, said that at 4:45, lorries in the convoy were surrounded by crowds of people as the vehicles approached the Blue Sea roundabout on the southwest edge of Gaza City, which again, of course, are going to be surrounded by people. The people in North Gaza especially have just been eating grass for the past few weeks. They're going to be absolutely desperate over anything they can possibly get. And that is that's the most normal of normal human reactions. Obviously, it is, honestly, I'd say it's pretty impressive, the kind of restraint that they showed even in this situation, given the pressure that they were under. And then we see this kind of really disgusting infrared drone footage that you just essentially just played this swarming music. This really what they wanted to, kind of wanted to put in the background, because you see the imagery of just little dots of Palestinians just circulating around the truck, kind of just desperate for food from way back above in black and white. So they just look like little insects just swarming the place where, you're meant to, you see these IDF soldiers as these, sympathetic figures. Which is really just, it's pretty horrific. It does show these events at the two locations where the BBC has verified. So the Israeli military vehicles kind of surrounding the convoy, and various instances of kind of, motionless people on the ground, just kind of completely separate and well spread out from the, kind of in the path, by the way, in the gun path of these Israeli military vehicles, but also really well spread out, from anywhere around the kind of main, clusters of people, which are obviously closer to the aid trucks. The second two sections of the video show events 500 meters further south. This time they show 4 static lorries. Again, people can be seen moving around them. This is the sections of these videos. The annotated section of the IDF highlight video on the BBC website kind of gives you as what I just tried to describe, gives you a kind of vision of what happened. They said they examined exclusive Al Jazeera video film close to the second location at the rear of the convoy, half a kilometer south of the roundabout. Volleys of the gunfire can be heard, and people can be seen scrambling over lorries and ducking behind the vehicles. Red tracer rounds can be seen from the sky. Mahmoud Awadea, you're definitely probably pronouncing that name incorrectly, unfortunately. Mahmoud Awadea. How about that? Okay, hopefully that's a little better. But they said the Israeli vehicles started firing at people when the aid arrived. Israel purposely fired at the men. They were trying to get, this said he was apparently an eyewitness here. They fired directly and prevented people from coming near those killed. Again, a very, very common theme of just the inability. We talked about, seen this multiple times, of just the inability of Israelis to let Gazans even deal with the dead in responsible, in dignified manner. And further footage they also verified filmed at where the shooting occurred of bodies being taken away on a cart north in the direction of the Nablusi roundabout. And they, these were people with clear gunshot wounds, even in the video. So Mohammed Salha, the interim hospital manager at Al-Ada Hospital, where many of the dead and injured were taken, told the BBC Al-Ada received around 176 injured people. 142 of these cases are bullet injuries, and the rest, so it's 142 out of 176, and the rest are from stampede and broken limbs in the upper and lower body parts. Because again, you are going to have a stampede, but is the stampede towards or away from the truck? Because people were shooting at it. So there was a stampede to get in the other direction. Because we see, for like the Las Vegas shooting, where we had the sniper firing in from that Mandalay Bay Hotel onto the country concert. There was a big chunk of injuries there from that stampede because there were so many people. You can only imagine how it would have been in Gaza with so many people just crowding around those trucks, just desperate for aid. So it's 13:06. That's 1:06 local time on Thursday. An IDF statement posted on Telegram stating, early this morning, during the entry of humanitarian aid trucks into the northern Gaza Strip, Gazan residents surrounded. By the way, this happened at 4 a.m., and they're talking about at 1 p.m. Later that day. So just keep that in mind about, how, intentional or just, they really kind of got maybe caught off guard, which just seems so crazy to say. I mean, they killed 100 people. They just opened fire randomly at a just completely unarmed, completely starving crowd. But they only responded to it here at 1 p.m. Early this morning, again, this come through as a result of pushing and shoving, essentially, that was injured dozens of Gazans. This is the original IDF statement on Telegram. The further IDF statement on X, formerly Twitter, repeated that description of the incident. In a further comment to UK's Channel 4 News, IDF spokesman Colonel Peter Lerner said a mob stormed the convoy at some stage, bringing it to a halt. The tanks that were there to secure the convoy see the Gazans being trampled, cautiously tries to disperse the mob with a few warning shots. This is from the Peter Lerner, the IDF colonel, spokesperson colonel, said IDF's Daniel Hagari claimed that hundreds became thousands and things got out of hand. They were backing up securely, not shooting at the mob, all this BS. But yet earlier in an interview, the Israeli Prime Minister's special advisor Mark Regev said that Israel had not been involved directly in any way and was not on the ground. So essentially saying the IDF wasn't even there at the time. He said the IDF had opened fire in a separate incident not related to the lorries, but did not provide further evidence. So essentially saying they weren't there at the time, just some other incident. Just completely nonsensical, making stuff up, and it's just being reported like it's in some way facts. And essentially just ridiculously, again, blaming it on Palestinian armed groups with no evidence. We said we don't know if it was Hamas or others. Leaders around the world have demanded an investigation into what happened, which is really just absolutely ridiculous. And again, I think the Electronic Intifada had some pretty good stuff. Because, again, we saw the massacre applauded by Itamar Ben-Gvir. A majority of Jewish Israelis opposed the transfer of humanitarian aid to Gaza. In a statement published on the Telegram channel, Hamas rejected the Israeli spokesperson's claims as baseless lies intended to cover up the heinous crime, accusing essentially, spokesperson for the Palestinian Health Ministry accused Israel of carrying out a premeditated massacre. It was not clear who sent the aid trucks, though with some people, interestingly enough, saying it was a trap. This was actually very interesting. According to some reports, this is from Palestinians who witnessed the Israeli attack on aid seekers in Gaza City. They say it was a trap because they had been called to come and say, "Oh, aid's going to be here at this time. Come, Palestinians." And the calls were coming from Israelis. Hani Mahmoud reported that Israeli gunboats, tanks, armored vehicles, and drones all opened fire on them. Palestinians who witnessed the Israeli attack on the aid seekers, they said it was a trap because, again, they were told to come to that location. The Euromed Human Rights Monitor said the Palestinians in the area received phone calls from the Israeli army in recent days ordering them to evacuate to the central and southern parts of the Strip in order to receive food, water, and avoid starvation. And interestingly enough, Yusri Al-Ghul, a Palestinian novelist and eyewitness to the massacre, told Al Jazeera there were no international or local institution that said they sent any aid to Gaza on that day. He said that every day people gather in the area near the Israeli tanks in anticipation of aid deliveries. We are starving. We don't find food, even the food of animals, for about 2 months, saying our children are starving. The Save the Children director saying people are just trying to get killed just to get food for their starving children. Really just a horrific story. As we see, again, clear evidence of gunshots, clear evidence of gunshot wounds, and just people continuing to, again, just only the paid propaganda at this point, continuing to feed us the BS. But unfortunately, the media is still very much reporting it exactly, like it's just one side says this and one side says that. All right. Speaking of our lovely media, this is absolutely an amazing piece here in the New York Times. And it talks about, this is in the Intercept here, about the New York Times coverage, specifically this screams without words story alleging really some mass Hamas rape, essentially that they set out on October 7th to rape as many Israeli women as possible. And so it talks about Anat Schwartz, who is the kind of, just I think, really just plucked out of nowhere, very, very young, no experience whatsoever in journalism. And the New York Times was just like, hey, what we want you to do, person with, deep ties to various Israeli institutions, including the IDF, we want you to take your nephew for some reason and go find as much, evidence as you can of sex crimes that were committed on October 7th by Hamas. And, we'll throw in Pulitzer winner Jeffrey Gettleman to do it with you. But by November, global opposition was already mounting against Israel's military campaign. And on her social media feed, which the Times has since said it's reviewing. Schwartz liked to tweet saying that Israel needed to turn the Strip into a slaughterhouse, saying, violate any norm on the way to victory. Those in front of us are human animals who do not hesitate to violate minimal rules. This is, again, someone who wrote one of the most consequential pieces of journalism yet in this war that was used to really, again, paint, all Palestinians as human animals and to justify their later genocide, which I think is a very, very important thing to say in this role. This posting of the story at the time that it was posted does have real impacts and real effects on Palestinian lives. Her reporting partner, Gettleman, had explained the basics to her, apparently, when she was just starting out, getting this offer from the New York Times. She said in a podcast interview on the 3rd of January conducted by Israel's Channel 12 in Hebrew. Gettleman says, she said, was concerned that they, she's really just pesky, always asking about, can we get at least 2 sources for every detail we put in the article, cross-check information, do we have forensic evidence, do we have visual evidence, apart from telling our reader, this happened, what can we say, can we tell what happened to whom? Schwartz said she was initially reluctant to take the assignment because she did not want to look at the visual image of potential assault and because, she lacked the expertise to conduct the investigation. Honestly, I can't see why she thought, the second thing there. Not at all. I think she was totally qualified. But anyway, victims of sexual assault are women who have experienced something and they come to sit in front of such a woman. Who am I anyway? I have no qualifications. Again, well, the New York Times chose her must have been a good decision. Meanwhile, this reporting she began working on with Schwartz and Annette Schwartz and Jeffrey Gettleman, and the nephew is the third writer, Adam Sella, who's the nephew of Annette Schwartz. So this episode essentially comes out, and it is not really received the best. It is, causes, according to the Intercept reporting here, a daily episode about it to be killed. This has all kind of been understood, but she's been really interviewed a lot about this since then in Israeli media, and the Intercept has been translating it. So here's the part we kind of referenced before. She says to Israeli Army Radio on the 31st of December, the New York Times said, let's do an investigation into sexual violence. It was more of a case of them having to convince me. Her host cut her off. It was a proposal of the New York Times, the entire thing. Unequivocally, obviously, of course. She said the paper stood behind us 200% and gave us the time, the investment, and the resources to go in-depth with this investigation as much as needed. Shortly after the war broke out, though, there's been some complaining about the fact that the Times was not letting Hamas, the writers call Hamas terrorists. So they really kind of essentially set out to challenge that. And as things kind of got more, pressured, essentially, this was the standards department. It was run by a guy named Philip Corbett. They talk about Corbett, after October 7th, defended the policy in the face of pressure, newsroom sources said, about not calling the Hamas militants terrorists, but he lost. On October 19th, this kind of almost a mafia-style, Goodfellas walking into the room all alone, Joe Pesci type situation. An email went out on behalf of the executive editor saying that Corbin was asked to step back from his position. After 14 years as the embodiment of Times standards, Phil Corbett has told us he's told us that he'd like to take a step back and let someone else take a leading role in this crucial effort. So again, the standards have left the building, folks. I think that is pretty clear to see. 3 newsroom sources, though, said the move was tied to the pressure he was under to soften coverage in Israel's favor. Meanwhile, Schwartz, again, the writer of one of the most prolific pieces of journalism of this entire war, if not the most, was sitting there liking tweets, meanwhile calling for Hamas to be likened to the Islamic State as much as possible. So this is a Times reporter who's also worked as an editor there, said, a lot of focus will understandably, rightfully, this is anonymous to the Intercept, rightfully be directed at Schwartz, but this is the most clearly poor editorial decision-making that undermines all the great work being tirelessly done across the paper, both related and completely unrelated to the war. They managed to challenge our readers and meet our standards. The Channel 12 podcast interview with Schwartz, which the Intercept translated from Hebrew, opens a window into the reporting process that they did. New York Times essentially completely standing by it. And Schwartz, who didn't respond to a request for comment, tweeted a response saying she's very happy that the New York Times stands by her. And we'll get to kind of how crazy this is. And they essentially go through here the next paragraph. In the podcast interview, Schwartz described her extensive efforts to get confirmation from Israeli hospitals, rape crisis centers, trauma recovery facilities, and sex assault hotlines in Israel. as well as her inability to get a single confirmation from any of them. She was told that there are no complaints made of sexual assault. The Times spokeswoman person acknowledged none at all to any kind of major Israeli law enforcement agencies or sexual assault help or support groups. The Intercept brought the Channel 12 podcast episode up to the paper's attention. This is what they acknowledged after the Intercept showed the Times this interview. This, however, was just the very first step of her research. She then describes the unfolding of evidence, testimonies, and eventual evidence that there may have been systematic use of sexual assault, which is, again, what the paper had to water down the claim to. She details her research steps and emphasizes the Times' strict standards to corroborate evidence, and it kind of goes on from there. The question has never been whether individual acts of sexual assault may have occurred, but really, again, it was much more about whether this was used as kind of a systematic weapon and just the dehumanization of just Palestinian people through this lie to do what we're seeing Israel do to them right now. I think that is the key part. So they essentially talk a lot about her going through all this effort, calling the rape crisis centers and all that, and getting no clear confirmation or evidence of any specific story. As Schwartz began her own efforts to find evidence of sexual assault, talk about trying to find evidence to fit a preordained conclusion. A person identified in anonymous media interviews as a paramedic from Israel Air Force Medical Unit 669 claimed that he had seen evidence that, saw evidence that two teenage girls in Kibbutz Nahal Oz had been raped and murdered in their bedroom. The man who made the other outrageous claims, however, that called his report into question. He claimed another rescuer pulled out of the garbage a baby who had been stabbed multiple times. He also said that he had seen Arabic sentences that were written on the entrances of the houses with the blood of the people that were living in the houses. So absolutely just like biblical, like, what they put on the door, we're going to kill your first son or something like that if you don't leave. That is, I think, it seems like where they're getting their inspiration from. None of these messages exist, and the story of the trash can was debunked. The bigger problem was that no two girls in the kibbutz fit the source's description. So this was the first kind of big evidence of this guy that came out that was really just pretty easily debunked. But Schwartz got excited after she saw those interviews, started calling people at the kibbutzes, and including Be'eri and other kibbutzes that were targeted on October 7th in an effort to track down the story. There was nothing, no one saw or heard anything, she said. This is in this interview, essentially saying we couldn't really talk to anybody. We didn't have anything really on the record. She reached until, then reached the 669 unit paramedic who relayed to Schwartz the same story he had told other media outlets, which he says convinced her there was a systemic nature to the sexual assault. I can say, okay, so it happened, one person saw it happen in Be'eri, so it can't just be one person because it's two girls, it's sisters, it's in the room. Something about it is systematic. Something about it feels to me that it is not random. Again, she's literally describing one person's event, and then every other story that this person has told of the time has been completely and utterly debunked. And this is a woman who is liking tweets in her own free time, which, is very, very telling. And we're supposed to try to be objective journalists working with the Pulitzer Prize winner, liking tweets to finish them, essentially, is what she was trying to put across there. And she, from this, gets to the conclusion again, we can really write the story about systemic rape. So Schwartz said she then began a series of extensive conversations with Israeli officials from Zaka, a private ultra-Orthodox rescue organization that had been documented to have mishandled evidence and spread multiple false stories about the events of October 7th, including debunked allegations of Hamas operatives beheading babies and cutting the fetus from a pregnant woman's body. Its workers were not trained in forensic science or crime scene experts. And this is really just an absolutely insane quote. This is somebody who's quoted widely. Yossi Landau was quoted widely both by Israeli and mainstream media just in the kind of week after October 7th, just detailing, horrific crime after horrific crime. He says, when we go into a house, we use our imagination. Yeah, this is no forensic training, no actual, grounding in facts in this. Literally saying, we use our imagination. The bodies were telling us what happened. That's what happened. So it sounds like an absolutely crazy person. You go there, you see someone stabbed. Oh, they were stabbed, 500 times and thrown in the garbage can. And that garbage can was thrown in the river. And each Hamas member took turns stomping on the garbage can. Like, it's just, you can add these ridiculous, fantastical details with the full knowledge that people report it, and that is exactly what they did. Landau is featured in the Times report, and there is no mention of his well-documented track record of disseminating sensational stories that were proven false. Schwartz said in her initial interview, Zaka members did not make any specific allegations of rape, but they described the general condition of bodies that they saw. Again, so seeing naked women and women without their underwear. Schwartz continued to look for evidence of various sites of the attack and found no witnesses to corroborate stories of rapes. I searched a lot in the kibbutzim, and apart from this testimony of the Israeli military paramedic, and additionally here people from Zaka, the stories didn't emerge from there. So where did they emerge from? Nowhere, because if you read this article up and down, the New York Times still has up, they watered it down and they have not put out any specific, again, source where stories emerged from, to use Anat Schwartz's words. She, again, so this is talking to, really, again, she essentially sees this on international news channels. This is interviews with Shari Mendes, and she goes, "Oh, let me talk to that guy." This is an American architect who served in a rabbinical unit of the IDF. Mendes was deployed to a morgue to prepare bodies for burial after the October 7th attacks and claimed to have seen voluminous evidence of sexual assault, saying, pelvises were broken, evidence of rapes. It takes a lot to it probably takes a lot to break a pelvis. It's like someone who's a real, expert in forensics there. This is not something we saw on the internet with our own eyes. Again, it's really been everywhere talking about this, despite the fact that there, I guess, apologize. It's a girl, Sherry Mendes. I don't know why. I guess I was thinking of Sean Mendes. I don't know. Sherry Mendes is a woman. I apologize for that. Mendes has been ubiquitous in Israeli government and major media narratives on the sexual violence of October 7th, despite the fact she has no medical or forensic credentials to legally determine rape. She had also spoken about other violence on October 7th, telling the Daily Mail in October, a baby was cut out of a pregnant woman and beheaded, and then the mother was beheaded. No pregnant women died that day, according to the official Israeli list of those killed in the attacks, and the independent research collective October 7th Fact Check said Mendy's story was false. So, again, this is another person they're using to really, push this out. As Schwartz saw interviews with Mendy, she further concluded the systemic, and she's just seeing these interviews, just planted and, almost funneling them into her own story, which then gets plastered in this really, kind of high echelon in the New York Times. It's just based off stories with other, media outlets that she's pulled and have really, by that time it was put out, a lot of these sources has really already been debunked. At the same time, Schwartz said she was feeling conflicted at times, wondering if she was becoming convinced of the truth of the overarching story precisely because she was looking for evidence to support the claim. Exactly as I said before. She pushed those doubts aside. By the time Schwartz interviewed Mendes, the IDF's reservist story had ricocheted around the world and been conclusively debunked. No baby was cut from a mother and beheaded. Yet Schwartz and the New York Times would go on to rely on Mendes' testimony, especially about sexual assault, with no mentions being made of Mendes' credibility. And it's kind of, it goes on to say, it's a little unclear about how Schwartz got there. Meanwhile, Sella was a freelance journalist covering stories on issues, is really hard-hitting journalist here. He was covering stories on issues ranging from food, photography, and culture to peace efforts, economics, and the occupation. Sella's first collaboration with Gettleman, published on October 14th, was a look at the trauma experienced by students at a university in southern Israel. For Schwartz, her first byline landed on the 14th of November. Israeli police officials shared more evidence on Tuesday of atrocities committed during the October 7th Hamas attack, saying they collected testimonies from more than 1,000 witnesses and survivors about sexual violence and abuses. Schwartz reported the story went on to quote Israel's police chief Kobi Shabtai, explaining a litany of evidence of gruesome killings and sexual assaults on October 7th, the most extensive investigation the state of Israel has known. Meanwhile, when the Times later put this article out, this definitive article. Schwartz and her partners reported that contrary to Shabtai's claim, forensic evidence of sexual violence was non-existent, without acknowledging the past statements by Shabtai and the Times. Again, that Schwartz herself reported. The paper reported that quick funerals in accordance with the Jewish tradition meant the evidence was not preserved. And really what a shame, though. You always got to follow the Jewish tradition, especially when your country goes through, as you would call it, 15 9/11s. On the podcast, Schwartz said her next step was to go to a new holistic therapy facility established to address the trauma, but essentially they didn't really want to talk to her because, again, they were just really traumatized, obviously, by all the sexual violence they had seen. Of course, in the end, Schwartz came away only with innuendo and general statements from therapists about how people process trauma, including sexual violence and rape. She said potential victims might be ashamed to speak out, experiencing survivor's guilt, or were still in shock. Perhaps also because Israeli society is conservative, there's some inclination to keep silence about this topic of sexual abuse. On top of this, there's probably the added dimension of the religious national aspect, that this was done by a terrorist, by someone from Hamas. There were lots and lots of layers to it so that they didn't speak. Again, just really unable to find, no evidence throughout this here. Schwartz essentially was also, again, this here's another one, just watching interviews given to international media outlets and saying, oh yeah, we should probably go interview that guy. Why not? This was Roz Cohen, who attended the Nova Festival. He's a member of, or veteran of, the Special Forces of the IDF. Cohen did multiple interviews about a rape he claimed to have witnessed. A few days after the attack, he told PBS NewsHour that he witnessed multiple rapes, and just, killing with knives, all that really awful stuff. Essentially saying there were 5 civilians that were taking part in it, regular people from Gaza with normal clothes. It was the interview that really, this hero gave the Times the title "Screams Without Words," but Cohen described then the alleged assailants not being members of Hamas, but Schwartz said in 2 podcast interviews, since the Times insisted on at least 2 sources. Again, what a pain in the ass that is. But she asked Cohen to give her the contact information of other people he was hiding within the bush so he could corroborate his story of rape. She recalled Ross hides in the bush next to him lies his friend Shom. They get to the bush. There are people. There are 2 other people on the other side looking in the same direction, and another 5th person. 5 people in the same bush. Only Ross sees all the things he sees because everyone else is looking in a different direction. That sucks. You're just not noticing. Ross Cohen, this guy, former IDF veteran, just happens to be the only one noticing the systemic rape by Hamas. No one else there can corroborate it, which is really just a shame. So she then weirdly says that no one saw it other than Roz Cohen on the podcast. But then in the article, the Screams Without Words article, Sean Guetta is presented as a corroborating witness of the rape. He said that he saw at least 4 men step out of the van and attack the woman, who ended up between their legs. He said that they were talking, giggling, and shouting, and then literally butchered this girl. Guetta said that did not mention witnessing a rape interview that he did with NBC News on October 8th, a day after the attack, but he did describe seeing a woman murdered with a knife. We saw terrorists, again, which is probably, far more likely considering what was going on that day than just, people just doing mass rapes all of the sudden. If you say something, if you make any noise, you'll be murdered, he told NBC at the time. So, again, there's been really just numerous inconsistencies flagged by a bunch of people, including, shout out to Electronic Intifada, also Max Blumenthal of The Gray Zone, Monda Weiss, and October 7 Fact Check. Under pressure internally to defend the veracity of the story, the Times reassigned Gettleman, Schwartz, and Salad to effectively re-report the story. But by January 29th, this was a resulting article published on January 29th, Cohen declined to speak to them, reported, asked this month why he had not mentioned the rape at first in the interview. Cohen cited the stress of his experience and said in a text message he had not realized then that he was one of the few surviving witnesses. And that number, it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller, which is very, very sad. So he declined to be interviewed again, saying he was working to recover from the trauma he suffered. Hopefully, maybe he can go to a rave, a therapy rave, and maybe on the border or something like that. I don't even know. Maybe wouldn't want to go back there. either way, hopefully he is able to recover from that trauma that he suffered. In addition to Cohen's testimony, Schwartz said on the Channel 12 podcast that she also watched this video of interrogation of a Palestinian prisoner taken by the IDF, whom she described as girls being dragged by Palestinian attackers into the woods near the Nova Festival. She was also moved, she said, by the clip of an interview she watched in a November press conference hosted by Israeli officials. That one became the focus of her Times article. Again, just watching stuff online, reporting it, and having it elevated to this high level is just absolutely crazy to me. And we're talking about, this just general kind of PR campaign, the Sheryl Sandberg event, talking about, sexual violence in war. And I think she's trying to do, this documentary about it, which should be, pretty interesting. Meanwhile, again, the 2-month-long Times investigation was still being edited and revised, Schwartz said in the podcast when she started to feel concerned about the timing. So I said, we're missing momentum. Maybe the UN isn't addressing sexual assault because no media outlet will come out with a declaration about what happened here. If the Times story doesn't publish soon, it may no longer be as interesting, Schwartz said. The delay was explained to her internally as, we don't want to make people sad before Christmas. So she also said Israeli police sources were pressuring her to move quickly to publish. She said that they asked her, what does the New York Times not believe there were sexual assaults here? Schwartz said she felt like she was in the middle. I'm also in this place. I'm also an Israeli, but I work for the New York Times. So all the time, I'm like in this place between the hammer and the anvil. It's a very interesting way of putting it. December 28th article screams without words, opening the story of Gal Abdush. And this is, again, the story that was first debunked here by the Electronic Intifada, also really by Gal Abdush's sister. Video of her charred body appeared to show her bottomless. Israel police officials said they believed that Abdush was raped. The Times reported the article labeled Abdush as a symbol of the horrors visited upon Israel, women, and girls during the October 7th attack. The Times report mentions the WhatsApp messages from Abdush and her family and her husband to the family, but don't mention that some family members believe the crucial messages make Israeli officials' claims implausible. As Mondoweiss later reported, Abdush texted her family at 6:51 a.m. saying there was trouble at the border. At 7, her husband messaged to say she'd been killed. Her family said the charring came from a grenade. It doesn't make any sense, said Abdush's sister in a short time span. They raped, slaughtered, and burned her in, again, all the span of 9 minutes. Speaking about the rape allegation, her brother-in-law said the media invented it. Another relative suggested the family was pressured under false pretenses to speak with reporters. Abdush's sister wrote on Instagram, the Times reporters mentioned they wanted to write a report in memory of Gal. That's it. If we knew, which is really kind of a just shitty thing to do, it's just in terms of basic journalistic ethics, to say the least. In its follow-up, the Times sought to discredit her initial comment, quoting Abdush's sister as saying, she had been confused about what happened and was trying to protect my sister. So really kind of a just scummy thing to do to a family of, who has lost a loved one very, very recently. The woman who filmed Abdush on October 7th told the Israeli site Ynet that Schwartz and Sella had pressured her into giving the paper access to her photos and videos for the purposes of serving Israeli propaganda. They called me again and again and explained how important it is to Israeli Hezbollah. And that is really a shock, just essentially saying, we need to do this to make Israel look good. Explaining how important it is to Israeli Hezbollah, which essentially is the Israeli word for propaganda. And these New York Times reporters pressuring this and passing this pressure, as we talked about before, down from on high is a really, really shocking story. This story is going to get chock full of just, wait a minute, this kind of makes the whole thing incredibly invalid details. And it's a 7,000 plus word story. At every turn, when the New York Times reporters ran into obstacles confirming tips, they turned to anonymous Israeli officials or witnesses who had already been interviewed repeatedly in the press. Months after sending off on their assignment, the reporters found themselves exactly where they had begun, relying overwhelmingly on the word of Israeli officers, soldiers, and Zaka workers to substantiate their claims that more than 30 bodies of women and girls were discovered with signs of sexual abuse. On the Channel 12 podcast, Schwartz said that the last remaining piece she needed for the story was a solid number from the Israeli authorities about any possible survivors of sexual violence. We have 4, and we can stand behind that number. She said she was told by the Ministry of Welfare and Social Affairs. No details were provided. The Times story ultimately reported that at least 3 women and 1 man were sexually assaulted and survived. But again, none of these people were named. Or no details. They don't even say they know who they are, but they didn't name them. Like, they didn't even go that far. And again, really, obviously, it was a big deal when it came out online. And she kind of celebrates it, saying, "In Israel, the reactions are amazing. Here I think I was given closure," saying that all the media treat the article and treat it as something of a thank you for putting a number on it. Thank you for saying there are many cases, that it was a pattern. Thank you for giving it a title which suggests that maybe there is something, is some organizing logic behind it. It was saying, talk about how Hamas weaponized it, rape on October 7th. So again, just really, essentially, thank you for playing into our narrative is how it looks like. Times staffers who spoke to the Intercept on the condition of anonymity for fear of reprisal described the Screams Without Words article as a product of the same mistakes that led to the disastrous editor's note and retraction of Rukmini Calamachi's podcast Caliphate and the print series on the Islamic State group. Khan, the current executive editor, was widely known as a promoter and protector of Kalamaki. The reporting, which Times determined in an internal review was not subjected to sufficient scrutiny by top editors and fell short of the paper's standards on ensuring accuracy, had been a finalist for a 2019 Pulitzer Prize. The honor, along with the prestigious awards, was rescinded in the wake of the scandal. Sometimes I joke it's another good day not to be the New York Times public editor, but the organization could really use one right now to investigate things on behalf of the readers, said the last public editor of the New York Times, Margaret Sullivan. At some story meetings, Schwartz said to the Channel 12 podcast with the editors with Middle East expertise were there to offer probing questions. We had a weekly meeting and you bring out the status of your work on the project, she said. And Times writers and editors who are concerned with Middle East affairs coming in from all kinds of places in the world, they ask you questions that challenge you, and it's excellent that they do that because you yourself all the time, like, you don't believe yourself for a moment. It's like, come on. She's just like doubting her own story here. Okay, and this is like, it's enraging, but it's also kind of hilarious and just like, almost in a really strange kind of way, just gratifying to see how little these people have and just how dishonest they are and how really just bad they are at being dishonest in terms of just pushing this atrocity propaganda. Because she's talking about these questions and she goes, one of the hardest questions you get asked, it's really the hardest ones to not be able to answer, is if this has happened in so many places, how can it be that there is no forensic evidence? How can it be that there is no documentation? How can it be that there's no records? A report, an Excel spreadsheet? You're telling me about Cherry Mendez? That's someone who saw with their own eyes and is now speaking to you. There is no written report to make what she's saying authoritative? The host interjected. And you went at that stage to those official Israeli authorities and asked that they give you something, anything? And how did they respond? There is nothing, Schwartz said. She was told there is no collection of evidence from the scene. But broadly, she said the editors were fully behind the project. There was no skepticism on their part ever, she claimed. It still doesn't mean I had the story because I didn't have a second source for many things. Okay, yeah. So, except for the ones that she, it seems made up for the moment. A Times spokesperson pointed to this portion of the interview as evidence of the paper's rigorous process. We have reviewed the wider transcript, and it's clear you're persisting in taking quotes out of context in the portion of the interview we referred to, and that describes being encouraged by editors to corroborate evidence and sources before we'd publish the investigation. Later, she discusses regular meetings with editors where they would ask hard and challenging questions, and at the time, again, she was not able to answer, but they still published it anyway. Like, just the fact that it's published and the fact that she says on the interview she had a hard time answering them, and there was A, that, and B, there is no skepticism, is a really big indictment in and of itself. Schwartz said she began working with Gettleman soon after October 7th. My job is to help him. She said he had all kinds of thoughts about things, about articles he wanted to do. She recalled on the first day, there were already 3 things on his lineup, and I saw that number 3 was sexual violence. Schwartz said that in the initial aftermath of October 7th, there was not much focus on sexual assaults, but by the time she began working for Gettleman, rumors began spreading that such acts had taken place. Most of it was based on the commentary of Zaka workers and IDF officials and soldiers. After the article was published, Gettleman was invited to speak on a panel about sexual violence at Columbia's University School of International and Public Affairs. This is where we had Hillary Clinton speaking there as well, and interviewed by Sheryl Sandberg. Instead of doubling down on the reporting that helped win the New York Times a prestigious Polk Award, Gettleman dismissed the need for reporters to provide evidence for their claims. What we found I don't want to even use the word evidence, because evidence is almost like a legal term that suggests you're trying to prove something like an allegation or prove a case in court. Gettleman told Sandberg, "That's not my role. We all have our roles, and my role is to document, is to present information. Again, just critically present information. It's to give people a voice. And whose voice are you giving? Like, it's just so blatantly incredible, incredibly absurd, and it just in and of its face. Like, if this was a real sophisticated propaganda operation, it'd be one thing. But the key thing is, this is a just shambolic operation, but there is no real acceptance of that, at least of yet." He finishes by saying, again, "That's our job as journalists, to get the information and to share the story in a way that makes people care, not just to inform, but to move people." Like, it's just like, are you a marketing executive or are you a journalist here? Like, it's ridiculous. And that is what I've been doing for a long time. One reporter said colleagues are wondering what a balanced approach might look like. "I'm waiting to see if the paper will report in depth, deploying the same kind of resources and means on the United Nations report that documented the horrors committed against Palestinian women." I guess that Times reporter, and I have a suspicion that Times reporter will be waiting for quite a long time. All right, so we're going to our last story now, and it is a doozy. President Biden is struggling to overcome doubts about his leadership inside his own party and broad dissatisfaction about the nation's direction, leaving him trailing behind Donald Trump as the new general election contest is about to begin. A new poll by, yes, I'm using them, the New York Times and Siena College has found. And yeah, for those, maybe people are wondering, saying, "Oh, it's hypocritical. You're talking about the New York Times badly in one story and using them in the next story." Again, it's two completely different things. And, they are, an important newspaper. They're an influential newspaper. It's important to cover what they say, to criticize what they say when they are wrong. But also, I think the fact is that the New York Times Siena polling is pretty damn good. So it is still worthy of using, and is still kind of, I'd say a separate part of the New York Times department. However, really just atrocious their conduct has been on this Screams Without Words issue. With 8 months to go before the November election, Biden's 43% support lags behind Trump's 48% support in the National Survey of Registered Voters. Only 1 in 4 voters think the country is moving in the right direction. More than twice as many voters believe Biden's policies have personally hurt them as believe his policies have helped them. A majority of voters who strongly disapprove of Biden's handling of his job has reached has reached higher than any time Siena polls at any point in his presidency. His worst, that this poll has found him in terms of disapproval. The poll offers a wide array of warning signs for the president, including weaknesses with the Democratic coalition, including women, Black, and Latino voters. And so far, it is Trump who has better unified his party, even amid, I guess you could call it, an ongoing primary contest. Biden has marched through the early nominating states with the only nominal opposition, which is just criminal and a complete show that the Democratic Party is not fit for purpose. But the polls show that Democrats remain deeply divided about the prospect of Biden, an 81-year-old chief executive, leading the party again. About as many Democratic primary voters said Biden should not be the nominee in 2024 as said he should, with opposition strongest among voters younger than 45 years old. No surprise there. Trump's ability to consolidate, again, which was a huge a source of turnout and support for Biden in 2020. Also, with women, we're seeing the suburban women be repulsed by Biden yet again, turn back to Trump just as they did in 2016, perhaps even in stronger numbers now. Trump's ability to consolidate the Republican base better than Biden has unified the base of his own party shows up starkly in the current thinking of 2020 voters. Trump is winning 97% of those who say they have voted for him 4 years ago, and virtually none of his past supporters say they're casting a ballot for Biden. In contrast, Biden is winning 83% of his 2020 voters, with 10% saying they now back Trump, which is a very, very big deal. But also, you notice 7% saying, just dropping out of that poll completely. It's going to be a very tough decision. I'm seriously thinking about not voting, says Mamta Misra, 57, a Democrat and economics professor in Lafayette, Louisiana, who voted for Biden in 2020. Trump voters are going to come out no matter what. For Democrats, it's going to be bad. I don't know why they're not thinking of someone else. It's just like, you're just looking at it from any sort of logical point, and just to see these people who come out and haughtily say, it's going to be Joe Biden as the nominee. You just have to accept it. and people are going to start to accept it. They're going to just come and support Joe Biden. It's just like so petulant, but at the same time, so condescending and, paternalistic. And it just, in the end, is so politically stupid because you can't just force people to like somebody in a democracy. Or obviously even in a dictatorship, for that matter. In last year's survey, Trump led by 2 points among registered voters, and Biden led by 2 points among the likely projected electorate. One of the more ominous findings for Biden is that the new poll is that the historical edge Democrats have had with the working class voters of color who did not attend college continues to erode. Again, the same thing that's happening to working class whites, complete class and racial disalignment from the Democratic Party is happening to these mostly probably Latino voters, black voters, specifically black men, not far behind. Biden won 72%, again, of voters of color who did not attend college in 2020 over the exit polls, providing him a nearly 50-point edge over Trump. Today, this is absolutely insane. 50 points down to 6, 47% to 41% among non-white voters who did not graduate from college. A lot of reasons for that. Probably just, again, flagging economy, weakness of Biden, probably a fair few concerned about Gaza, a fair few just Biden's complete ineffectiveness throughout his presidential term. Excitement gap between the two parties shows up repeatedly in the survey. Only 23% of Democratic voters. Also, by the way, the fact he's so goddamn old. Only 23% of Democratic primary voters said they were enthusiastic about Biden, half the share of the Republicans who said they were about Trump. Significantly more Democrats said that they were either dissatisfied or angry at Biden being the leader of the party, 32%, than Republicans who said the same about Trump, 18%. So, again, all this hype about these never Trump Republicans, there's got a lot more never Biden Democrats. So both Biden and Trump are unpopular. Big surprise. Trump had a weak 44% approval rating. Biden fared 6% lower at 38%. Among 90% of voters who said they disapproved of both likely nominees, an unusually large cohort in 2024 that pollsters and political strategists sometimes call the double haters, which is kind of a stupid name. Biden led Trump 45 to 33%, which is probably the best piece of news, because these are the people that are, if they do come out and vote, are going to decide the election. The candidate, here as we see, the candidate who had won such double haters was victorious in the elections in both 2016 and 2020, because it's this negative polarization and this fear of the other guy driving people to support, again, the common phrase ever since 2016, really, the lesser of two evils. For now, though, unhappiness with the state of the country is plainly a drag on Biden's prospects. 2/3 of the country feels the nation's headed in the wrong direction, and Trump is winning 63% of those voters. The share of the voters who believe the nation's on the right track remains a dismal and diminutive minority at 24%, yet even that figure is marked improvement from the peak inflationary days of summer of 2022, where only 13% of voters felt the nation was headed in the proper direction. Oscar Rivera, a 39-year-old independent voter who owns a roofing business in Rochester, probably one of those people, if I had to make a little bit of assumption, is in that non-white group who did not attend college, again, owning a roofing business, probably learning a trade type vibe. He says, if we get Trump for another 4 years, we get a little better on economics, is what he said, which is, a case that Biden should absolutely continue to fight, I think really fight for and be winning, because it's probably one of his best areas, although there is some really big flaws that he has obviously done, some personal just mistakes that he has made. Trump's policies also were generally reviewed far more favorably by voters than Biden's. A full 40% of voters said Trump's policies had helped them personally. And again, this is all down to, if you look at the merits, of course, Biden, it's very, very hard to name one thing that Trump did, that was significant, period, beyond a lot of just, rhetorical stuff and, renegotiations of some trade deals, which probably actually did help a lot for some people now that I actually bring it up. But, there's definitely a case Biden can make here. He's just completely not making it. He's completely falling flat on the ability to make that. Only 12% of independent voters like Rivera said Biden's policies had personally helped them, compared to 43% who said his policies had hurt them. Rivera, who is Puerto Rican, said he doesn't like the way Trump talks about immigration and the southern border, but is planning to vote for him anyway. Biden, I don't know, Rivera said. It looks like we're weak. America's weak. We need someone stronger. And this is somebody who really does break, I think, a lot of people in kind of the liberal bubble's minds, because they're just like, wait a minute. he's not really freaked out about immigration and Trump and saying build the wall and all that kind of stuff. And again, I think it's fair to say that Biden is not that much better. But, it is kind of goes to a lot of, people's just, again, false assumptions that, again, a lot like the black vote, the Latino vote acts kind of as a monolith, and that they have all these like high amounts of sympathy for people that just because they have the same color skin, they're coming in as immigrants. And it's like, it would be nice if everyone had sympathy for immigrants, but that is just not the political reality. Like a lot of people say, I'm part of this country. If they can get in the right way, that's great. We welcome them. But if not, I don't really care about them. I care about my own life because we want better economics. I want someone who's strong. Those type of things are leading a lot of people to say, and someone who's not 82 years old, I want someone like Donald Trump. But over and over, the Times CNN poll revealed how Trump has cut into more traditional Democratic constituencies while holding his ground among Republican groups. The gender gap, for instance, is no longer benefiting Democrats. Women who strongly favored Biden 4 years ago, one of the biggest keys to his victory. This is where we see probably why he won Atlanta, probably why he won Philadelphia. Just all these states, or Pennsylvania, probably why he did so well in Texas. If it hadn't been for people like Oscar Rivera, the people who most likely did not go to college, the people who are, Latino on the border, with Mexico, who turned for Trump in 2020 in big numbers. So there you go. It's like there's two parts of the coalition that Biden is alienating kind of both in different ways. There are, of course, the unpredictable X factors in a race where a Republican frontrunner is facing 4 indictments, 91 felony counts, and I'm sorry, those are all going to happen after the election. The poll showed that 53% of voters currently believe that Trump has committed serious federal crimes, down from 58% in December. But viewed another way, Trump's current lead over Biden is built with a significant number of voters who believe he is a criminal, which is really a sign of the times, to say the least. But by a narrow margin, more voters favor making it more difficult for migrants at the border to seek asylum, 49% to 43%. And that's what happens, by the way, when you have both parties just yelling about a crisis at the border with no side speaking up for a pathway to citizenship, no side speaking up for the dignity of these migrants. 40% of voters say they sympathize more with Israel compared to the Palestinians. Trump was winning with 70% of those who backed Israel primarily. Biden was winning with 68% of those who sided with the Palestinians, which is honestly a pretty surprising, part of that poll. Philip Calorical, 51-year-old anesthesiologist in Decatur, Georgia, is a Democrat dismayed by Biden's handling of the humanitarian fallout from the conflict in Gaza. And by the way, this is the white moderate, this is the area, if I'm really not mistaken, this is the area where, off of that kind of white moderate, formerly Republican support, this is the area where really Biden was able to win the election and win Georgia in such a big way last time. So he is a 51-year-old anesthesiologist. He said Joe Biden, this is probably some of the last people, by the way, that you expect to feel this way about Gaza. Joe Biden should be doing more to ensure that Israeli government goes essentially saying, stop Israel from killing civilians. And yeah, but as we see, I was right. He's a white guy who lives in a pretty nice suburb, whose city probably went, or town probably went Republican as recently as like 2016 or 2017. The Biden campaign hopes that more and more voters like Mr. Calorical snap back into the usual partisan patterns in the coming months. And he essentially says, I understand my vote or lack of vote carries a consequence. But I do want to register my displeasure. The way I vote doesn't mean I like it. And I bet a lot of Americans would mean that statement. So essentially, Biden, they're hoping the media can kind of hypnotize Democratic voters into being scared of Trump again. Honestly, not, the worst bet in the world. But the return of such reluctant Democrats is one reason the Biden campaign has been optimistic polling will narrow and eventually flip as the choice of Trump and Biden becomes clearer. So meanwhile, Biden, though, Haley leads Biden by double the margin of the former president, a hypothetical 45 to 35% margin. But she has struggled to gain traction within her primary. A lot of interesting stuff. We are so over time. Hopefully you enjoyed a little bit of a longer show. We'll be back to our normal 30-minute length instead of an hour and 3 minutes. Oh my gosh. But hopefully it was worth it. I think it was. We'll see you on Monday.